Welcome back! I've had a ton of comments from people asking what kind of sewing techniques I use to build the puppets. Now there are many different types of hand stitches that people use, but I'm going to show you two of my favorite. When hand sewing, the main stitch that I use to make 90% of the puppet is called a whip stitch. I use it because it's an extremely strong hand stitch. It also happens to be one of the most simple. The other stitch I use for the final touches is called the ladder stitch. It goes by some other names too, like slip stitch and invisible stitch. It might have some other names too. Now the ladder stitch is not as near as strong as the whip stitch, so I do not recommend using the ladder stitch to complete your whole puppet. It's just not gonna last. The ladder stitch is good for the finishing touches. Now we're going to whip stitch these two pieces of fur together. So first of all, when you're stitching it, you want to stitch from the back. So I lay the fur side down. So for the whip stitch, here's what you do. So you go in the backing on one side, and then in through the front on the other side, close to the edge, and you pull around. So there's the first stitch. Now I go back in through the back of this one, and in through the face of this one. It's kind of hard to do without covering it up. Okay, so right now I'm doing it very loose so you can see, and hopefully you can see that white thread very clearly on this dark fur. So there it is again. So going in one side and out the other. Alright, and here it is all stitched together. Now this is much wider of a stitch than I would do for a final puppet. I just did it a little wider so you can see for demonstration purposes. How it would actually look is more like this one. You can probably barely see those stitches just because they're so small and close together. Here's a side by side to show you the two different stitches. Again, this is a really loose stitch. I would not recommend doing it this loose for your actual puppet. Again, just for demonstration purposes. And this is how it should actually look. But when you flip it over, you can see on the fur side, you can't even tell that there was even on this loose one, you can't even really tell that there was a seam there, which is really nice. This is a piece of the nylon fleece, also known as Antron fleece, already cut in half and stitched together. You can tell that it does a pretty good job of hiding the seams as well. But if you look closely, again, that's how tiny these stitches are. They're extremely small, but it's the exact same technique you just saw me do with this fur one. Now for the ladder stitch. Let me show you a quick little sketch. So let's say this is our fabric here. So what we just did with the whip stitch is we had our thread. It goes in one side, underneath, out this side, loops around, and continues this spiral motion. And this spiral is what makes the thread and the stitch. This is what makes it so much stronger than the ladder stitch. But the ladder stitch works a little differently. You actually start with it knotted on the inside, okay? And then you come up through the fabric here, you stitch across, you go in the fabric there, and then you actually, let me use another color. This red will represent going underneath the fabric. You go inside this, and then you come up through this side, across, back in there, underneath the fabric, coming across, so it looks like the rungs of a ladder. So just to be clear, the whole thread movement, let's say you start underneath on this side, it goes in, across, underneath, across, underneath, across, and it continues that way. I've already started it on this piece here, but you can see the thread going across each time, like a ladder. So you do this from the front side of the fabric. So I go in, and up, straight across, in and up, straight across, in and up, straight across, in and up. Just like that. Now what makes this stitch handy is that, as you can see, I can do it from the outside of the fabric. Whereas if I do the whip stitch from the outside of the fabric, you'd see the stitch. But if I do it on the back side, it completely hides it on this side, okay? But again, what's nice about this is you can see the rungs going across. When I pull this string, the thread tightly, it actually brings all those pieces together just like that. Now when you're closing up your puppet, you'd want to go back and pick your seams to try to get rid of as much of that seam as you can. Now I want to talk about why the whip stitch is so much stronger than the ladder stitch. With the whip stitch, because the thread is coiled around, it makes it a lot stronger and gives it a little bit of stretch so it won't break. The reason the whip stitch is so strong is because that thread is actually coiled all the way around and it's making a lot of contact with the fabric. And that slight amount of coil lets it stretch just a little bit, making it much stronger. I couldn't break this if I wanted to, okay? Whereas with the ladder stitch, once you pull the two sides together, it's actually only one piece of thread going straight across. There's no coil to it. So the strength is only as strong as the thread. So if I give this a little tug, I can feel the tension on the thread. And if I go just a little harder, you can actually have it break just like that. So it really shouldn't be used for any structural part of the puppet. Again, I only use it to close up the tiny seam in the back. So when I'm stitching my puppets together, I use the whip stitch on the entire thing, especially in places where there's a lot of stress, like the neck and in the arms. The only part that has the ladder stitch is just this small section right here. When I have the foam body, I take the covering and I wrap it around this way. I stitch as far up as I can with the whip stitch, and then again that last couple inches is what I use the ladder stitch for. I've experimented with all different types of stitches, and these are the ones that I like the most. I know a bunch of people are gonna ask about the baseball stitch and other stitches. Do whatever works best for you. Hopefully this video will help a lot of people who do not have sewing machines. You do not need a sewing machine to make a quality puppet. And a lot of people even wonder what's better, hand sewing or machine sewing. At the end of the day, that depends on how well you sew. Another video I have planned coming up soon are different setups for filming puppetry. Thanks for stopping by and see you next time.